Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist and historical linguist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and on my channel I talk quite a bit about questions of Norse language and myth, sometimes about more general historical linguistics. That is a deep interest shared by my good old friend Dr. Luke Gorton, who now teaches at the University of New Mexico. We got our master's degrees together in historical linguistics at the University of Georgia. And today I'm going to have a conversation with Luke about magic in the ancient and medieval world, getting into some of the linguistics about it. And for Patreon, we might also have a few old stories to share, perhaps. So, Luke, tell us about yourself a little bit, what you do at the University of New Mexico, and about what you do with magic.
Yeah, well, not to disappoint your viewers, but I'm not going to teach anybody how to do magic. That's a joke that I like to make at the beginning of every semester in my class that I teach at UNM called Magic and Ancient Religion. Um, I basically did a degree with Jackson, an MA at the University of Georgia in linguistics, as he mentioned, and that's when we met. And we went our separate ways, but of course stayed good friends ever since and have been sharing a lot of great information with each other. When Jackson went to do his PhD in Scandinavian linguistics and studies in general, I went on to Ohio State and did my PhD in classical studies with a minor in ancient Mediterranean religions. So I'm really into the languages, cultures, religions of the ancient Mediterranean world, essentially. And that's sort of how I started getting interested in ancient magic, because that's really something that is closely connected to religious traditions
Sure.
in the ancient Mediterranean world. And this is, I'm sure, something we'll get into, but it's not something that was as separate for them from religion as it might be for most people today. This is something that I sort of challenge my class on all semester long when I teach it at UNM, and I try to get them to think about their categories of what's religious, what's magical, how do we tell the difference. It can be easy for us today because we have these ideas and we have this line that kind of separates them, in the popular imagination at least. But really, in the ancient Mediterranean world, that line didn't exist yet. So when I study ancient religions, I'm also studying some things that we might call ancient magic.
So, Luke, you have started your own YouTube channel
I have.
called Word Safari.
I have, yeah.
What can we find on Word Safari besides part of this interview?
Yeah, well, Word Safari is a channel, and I just started it. There's just a few videos up right now. But it's essentially dedicated to my love of language and ancient culture and the connections there. So I spend each episode just basically digging into a theme, or a set of words that are connected to each other, maybe a family of words. I just posted a video on magic words, so you can go see some of that material that we've just been talking about, and some other words too. But it's from an English perspective, so I talk about where the word incantation comes from, the word spell comes from, which is of course from your neck of the woods, linguistically speaking. So that's really what Word Safari is. It's exactly what it sounds like. I came up with the name because I like to take adventures, safaris through the jungle of etymology and ancient culture. So we just pick a topic and dive into it and talk about all the interesting connections that are there.
So, the terms used for magic in the ancient world,
Yeah.
how would you translate them if there were not some maybe prejudice coming from old dictionaries to
Sure.
translate X word as magic?
Yeah, that's a great place to start because the religious terminology is really right at the heart of what I'm interested in as both a linguist and a scholar of ancient religions. And you can really get a lot from digging into the meanings of these words, what they originally meant, what their etymologies are, and then looking at how they get used in the ancient texts. So the first thing to note is when you go all the way back to the beginning of ancient Greek literature, if we go back that far to the works of Homer, which most people are familiar with, and I'm sure many of you have read them, the word magic doesn't occur. And the reason it doesn't occur is because it hasn't been invented yet. There are things that when we read the Iliad or the Odyssey, we might identify certain things as magic and say, oh, that's magic, but they don't call it that. So that's really up to our, as you said, kind of our modern prejudice, maybe, our modern way of looking at things. But they wouldn't have split the world up into magic and religion like we do today, as far as like supernatural things are concerned. So the words that they use in Homer, that oldest layer of text that we have in the ancient Greek world, are words that don't necessarily need to be translated magically, but oftentimes should be. So one of the biggest ones that we see in Homer is pharmakon.
Okay.
And we get all of our pharmacology, pharmacist, pharmacy words from this root. And in ancient Greek, it could mean a drug, which is why we get all of these drug-related words from it. But it could just mean anything that heals you, and it could also mean something that hurts you, just like drugs can be good or bad, right? So it can really go either way.
What is the root? Is that from the Carry root?
I don't think so, and I'm actually not sure what that root goes back to in Indo-European. It's got too many consonants to be a good Indo-European root, pharmak. It's really too long, so I'm not actually sure. I'd have to double check that, but it's not a good Indo-European root that we can obviously map on. Now there's a whole family of words that are connected to that pharmak root, but I don't know if there's any solid connections that we can make outside of that.
Well, there's so many non-Indo-European words in Greek
Absolutely,
too, right?
absolutely.
Thalassa.
Yeah. When the Greeks came to what we would today call Greece, they found other cultures there and assimilated with them, conquered them, some mixture of the two, and then they took a lot of their words. And those cultures that they found already were fairly well advanced in some ways. So it wouldn't be surprising if that was one of these substrate words that come from one of these older languages.
All right, so this pharmakon,
Yeah.
which you see already in Homer.
Mm-hmm.
So what is an example of pharmakon in, say, the Iliad?
Yeah, I can give you a few. The first one that popped in my head, which is pretty instructive, is actually from the Odyssey, and Helen, the famous Helen of Troy, who of course launched 1,000 ships, et cetera, et cetera. This is in the Odyssey, so this is after the Trojan War. She's back home with her original husband Menelaus, and Telemachus comes to visit, and Telemachus is Odysseus' son. He's looking for him. And Menelaus and Telemachus and the whole family get to talking about the Trojan War and all the people they've lost and all the sad things that have happened, and they start crying. They're not very happy about it. Of course, Helen probably feels a little bit guilty because she kind of caused the whole thing. So she, it turns out, according to this account, that she has been down to Egypt and has learned some what we would today call magic from an Egyptian woman. And that's actually a really common trope in the ancient world, that Egyptians are very magical people and women are very magical people. So you get that cross of Egyptian and women, and they're going to know a lot. At least that's the stereotype.
And that's so funny because, I mean, so often in cultures all around the world,
Yeah.
the magic people are the neighboring people that we don't really understand.
Right.
Because
Exactly.
to the Norse,
Yeah.
it's the Sami.
Huh. Yeah.
In early American frontier culture, it's often American Indians.
Yeah.
Right? Like this
Right.
notion that we don't really understand you, but
Yep.
we border you.
Yes.
So yeah, anything
Yeah.
weird and that we don't fully understand is coming from you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's some power to it. Like, we don't understand it, we don't get it. We might not even like you guys very much, but we respect that you have some knowledge that we don't have, and you have some power that we don't have. And so it's something mysterious.
Yeah, and it often is women too in the Old Norse context as well. Very often, I mean,
Yeah.
the vulva is the classic Norse female seeress witch healer figure.
Yeah.
So a very similar thing.
Yeah, and there may be something similar going on there under the surface, where for men who are mostly writing these texts, the women are the other, who are not fully understood by the male community, and so they're powerful. They're doing some weird stuff. We men don't really understand it.
Yeah. So is childbirth or childbirth associated activities bound up in the pharmakon terminology?
Not that I'm aware of, actually.
Okay.
But what it is it seems to be something that originally is associated more with women, and the reason is that pharmaca, which is the plural of pharmakon, pharmaca are oftentimes plant-based. And a lot of ancient cultures associate women more with plant knowledge than men. And this may go all the way back to a Neolithic period when the man would go out stereotypically hunting the animals and the women would be gathering, herbs or something. So the woman would be more expected to know about these things in the Stone Age, maybe. And this may be carried on into Bronze and Iron Age civilizations where there's still these stereotypes about women knowing their plants better than men do. And that includes herbs and other magical things that come from plants, right?
Well, and of course, it's very legitimate. I mean, we're sitting right here. I don't know how far the window of this video goes, but we're surrounded by aspen.
Yep.
And just a few minutes ago, I was rubbing my hands across this to show my brother the bark.
Yeah.
And I mean, that does have some pain relief facilities. And you don't understand that in a pre-scientific age when you don't understand chemistry and such.
Right.
So there is something kind of magical about just being able to cause any kind of effect, or making beer.
Sure.
Right, that's kind of a magical effect from a.
How does it
from a plant.
transition?
Yeah.
Yeah, and even making wine in some ways, which happens a little more naturally than making beer. But the Greek god Dionysus gets associated with things that we today might call magic.
And
In
also
some
with
ways,
women.
yeah, and with women, right? So you get wine, you get women, you get Dionysus all together in this magical bubble, if you want to call it that. Now again, they didn't call it that, but we
Right,
might
right,
call
right.
it that. So getting back to Helen, she knows her drugs. She's learned from the best, and she slips a pharmacon into the wine that these men are drinking, and they stop crying. It's like an antidepressant, is essentially what it is. And they don't even know she did it. She does it slyly when when she's preparing the wine and mixing it in the bowl for them. But it's not an evil thing she does. It's a good thing she does.
Right.
So we see that there's this ambiguity where women with knowledge can use it for good or evil, and we see that in different ancient Greek stories that these women who know a lot and are very powerful, you can't always trust them, but that doesn't mean they're always bad.
Yeah, she's being sly,
Yes,
but not malevolent.
sneaky
Yeah,
but not
yeah.
malevolent. Exactly.
Which is much like Grimhilder and the Volsung's materials. She uses all kinds of potions to benefit her family. Of course, it's ambiguous whether it's sort of hurting somebody outside the family. But yeah, she's being sly, but ultimately beneficial toward her own kin unit anyway.
Right.
Huh. All right, so you got Pharmacon, which has, I guess, maybe overtones we would call a little bit herbalistic.
Yes, although it's not always plant based, but it's often plant based.
Okay.
It can be used for other things that might heal you. So, for instance, there's one text that we have from another ancient Greek author, Pindar, where he says that if you get a splint, like if you have a broken bone and you just get a splint, that's a pharmacon because it's healing you, it's helping you
okay.
out, and we would call that medical science today, right? But for Pindar, that's the same word as these drugs that we don't necessarily understand how they work. So it's a totally different way of looking at the world.
Does this get associated with the techno vocabulary? Is that?
So that comes from a Greek word techne, which means a skill or an
Yeah.
artifice or something like that. I haven't seen the two connected, but they could be. I could see them saying that if you learn how to use pharmaca, that's a techne. That's a skill. That's an art that you develop, maybe.
Well, because in Old Norse, one of the most common words for magic is fjolkingi, which is much knowing.
Interesting.
Right, so
Yeah.
the one who's magical is,
Yeah.
is very, very knowledgeable.
Right.
And so you get all these words kind of bound together, yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, words like witch, which we were talking about the other day,
Yep.
which probably goes back to the same root as wit, to know, and kind of like the knowing one.
Sure.
All right, so this pharmacon, one term that I always think about in association with the ancient world of magic is the goetia
Yeah.
word.
Yeah.
So how does that get used?
That comes from a root that we think originally meant to wail, to cry out, or something like
Okay.
that. And just like a lot of these words that we might translate magically today, it started out in a fairly banal way. A goes, which is from this root, was somebody whom you might hire to wail at your family member's funeral. This strikes us a little bit weird today, but for them, they thought it was normal to have a lot of people crying at a loved one's funeral. And the more people who are crying and the more noise they're making, the more beloved they are. So it looks good, right? So you might actually hire professional criers, which again sounds really weird to us today. Why would you do this? But they would. And a goes would be someone who would come and wail at your funeral, and they would be professional criers.
Okay.
Now, as time went on, their connection with funerals also came to carry a connotation of connection with the dead in some way. Like maybe they're not just crying, but they have a special techne of being able to communicate with the spirit of the dead person, maybe, and tell us how they're feeling and if they're happy with what we're doing with their funeral and things like that. So you get the noun goeteo, which comes from the same root that later comes to mean something like sorcery or something like that, but it didn't necessarily originally mean that.
Almost as if the word for magic here were something like mourning. Mourning, right? Like
Right.
That's, yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, the funeral is a place where people look for or want to find something magical or supernatural.
Yes.
We want to think that we're being connected
Oh,
to
yeah.
that next realm where our past loved one is going.
Yes.
I wonder if that sort of almost universal human trope of wanting to show the proper amount of bewailing at a funeral, because you see this among American Indian tribes too.
Sure.
You see it among the Norse, and you see it in the Old Testament.
Oh yeah. Oh
Right,
yeah.
and
There's
this is
there's
really-
certain rituals that you're supposed to carry out when someone dies, and a lot of cultures, like you said, they're very similar. In the Old Testament, you get people ripping their hair out and
Yeah.
women beating their breasts and things like that. So it's very stereotyped. That's just what you do.
Yeah. Which, I mean, the dead are, in a sense, if we consider them to still be present somewhere, they might have a connection to magic that we lack as the living. I mean, we certainly see that in the Norse texts.
Yeah.
The most powerful witches are the dead ones that you go and wake up out of dead. Do we see something similar in the ancient world?
We see it developing in the ancient Greek world. So in the earliest text that we have, in other words, Homer, the dead seem to be pretty far removed from the world of the living. You get a lot of people dying in the Iliad, and they don't come back. It's really hard to communicate with them. You have a few isolated scenes like the dead Achilles demanding something, but that's the exception and not the rule. So it seems like in the early cosmology, if you want to call it that, the dead are pretty dead. In Odyssey book 11, Odysseus goes to the underworld, but he has to sail to the western edge of the world, like through what we would call the Straits of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Hercules. He sails out into the Atlantic Ocean. At least it seems like that's the geography. It's a little iffy because they didn't necessarily know their geography exactly, but that seems to be what it's trying to say. He sails out into the ocean, crosses the ocean, gets to the other side, and that's where the underworld is. So he has to go on this huge journey, and he can't even get there if there weren't this witch, Circe, who gives him directions. So the idea is, if you're a regular person, you're never going to get to the underworld. You're never going to get to talk to those dead people. But, in the early period.
But that's also, I'll note, a witch who knows the way.
Yes.
Right? So the
the
magically empowered are the ones who have some connections to that world of the dead.
Absolutely.
Is the Witch of Endor dead?
That's another good question. So this is actually, I spent a whole week on this fascinating collocation of dead people, if you want to call them that, in texts from the ancient Mediterranean. So in Homer, you get the dead being pretty dead. But then when we look at texts from the classical period, only 300-400 years later, we start to see that the dead are not as dead anymore. It's easier to call them up. And one of the theories that we have is that the reason that the Greeks kind of evolved their thinking on this is that they started to come into more contact with peoples to the east, maybe Semitic peoples, maybe not specifically the Israelites, but we know the Israelites' neighbors, the Phoenicians, were sailing all over the Mediterranean. They had a lot of contact with the Greeks. So we suspect that there were already what you might call more evolved ideas about being able to contact the dead east of the Greeks. And so the story of the Witch of Endor in 1 Samuel 28 is a great example of this, because King Saul of Israel is able to call up the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel. And so the dead don't seem to be that dead in this story that actually chronologically was probably written between Homer and some of the classical Greek literature. So it kind of provides a bridge.
I always think when we consider the dead in the Odyssey of the scene where Achilles says that he would rather be the poorest slave among the living than king among all the dead, something like that.
That's what he says, yeah.
And it's a reminder that even ideas of the underworld have changed greatly.
They evolved so much in that 1,000-year period or so.
Right, it goes from something that is very distant and you don't want any part of.
Right, not a punishment, just where everybody goes.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Much
it's not hell. It's just a dark cave that's depressing because you're dead.
Right, which is much the same as hell, 1L.
Yeah, the original
Norse.
etymon of hell. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
So, all right, we've got Pharmacon, which has often herbalistic associations.
Yeah.
We've got the Goetia complex of terms, which has its origin fascinatingly in funeral, not oratory even, but wailing. All right. Other terms?
Yeah, well, another one that's big in Homer, and really one of the only other ones that is big in Homer, is epaoide, which comes from two Greek roots, ep, which is onto, at, something like that, and aoide, which means song or recitation.
Is that from the no root?
It's actually not, believe it or not, but it looks like the no root. It has the alpha on the front of it. It was probably aoid. Yeah, exactly. But it's very similar. And it did have a W there originally, aoido. So very close. But so it means to sing or to recite or to chant or something like that. And it's the regular boring word. If you sing a song, if you recite a poem, you're gonna aedo it. I mean, that's the verb you use. But then if you have an epaoide, it's something that you chant at something or onto something or even against something if it's malicious. And so we get this word several times in Homer that you can translate incantation, make it sound really magical, you don't have to translate it that way though. You can translate it chant or something like that, which sounds less magical. So the way that you choose to translate these words actually shapes the perception of the reader in English as to how magical this event is.
Of course. Well, and that makes me think about work chants, right? I mean, there's so many. This probably isn't so true anymore, where people have the same job for 3 months,
Yeah.
right? But in a time when work was basically passed down generation to generation, and a community, you know, a whole community of woodsmen or farmers or hunters or something, you might have particular work songs, like work chants.
Yep.
And I sometimes wonder if one of the origins of these magical songs or spells is that a chant that's associated with a particular task, that correlation becomes causation. Right?
Yes.
Like, this is how you make, so like if I say heave ho every time I'm cutting trees, it's as if over time, maybe as the community gets further away from the trade of the woodsman, or maybe gets more involved in it, I don't know. But it's almost as if heave ho becomes the song that brings the tree down.
Right. Right.
Is that a reasonable way of putting this?
Yeah. So one of the interesting scenes we have from Homer where somebody uses an epaoide is it's in a flashback scene from the Odyssey where the teenage Odysseus has gone out for a wild boar hunt. And the wild boar gores his leg and gives him a nasty gash, which of course in those days could easily become fatal, right?
Sure.
So it's very concerning, very worrying. And his friends, whom he's with on this boar hunt, they do two things. They bind up his leg skillfully, so they're like doing a good doctor thing, right? I mean, they're doing what we would call something, you know, good to heal him, right? It's not magical at all. But then they also chant an epaoide over the wound. And then carry him home. So these two things go together with our modern scientific minds. We say, okay, that's science, that's magic.
Right.
But for them, they're not using these terms. They're not looking at the world in this way. They're thinking that is all part of one thing you do to heal somebody.
And we don't actually know which one causes the healing.
Right. Yeah. And you know, I have to give a shout out to some of my former students in my magic class that I've taught over the years, because I always ask them about this and say, is this magic or religion? And they've come up with some interesting comments on this text, because I remember one student raised their hand last year when I taught this class and said, well, you know, that chant actually could help. And I said, how so? And she said, well, I'm a pre-med major, so I think about these kind of things, and the chant actually could have calmed him down. And then if you calm somebody down, you lower their blood pressure, and if you lower their blood pressure, the blood will stop spurting out of the wound so fast, and it might save his life, right?
Sure.
So there could be some kind of placebo effect there, where we might think of just dismissing it as magic, but there could actually be a physiological effect there.
I can absolutely believe that. And then, of course, in a sense, the song has an effect, right?
Yeah, I mean, psychologically it has an effect on all of them.
Right, but I mean it's still affecting blood flow or something like that, right? I mean, so is that not medicinal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's an interesting point. All right, well, props to the student.
Yeah, absolutely. I've gotten a lot of great comments from my students teaching this class. It's made me think of a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, me too. You know, an engaged group of students is the best teacher for the teacher. Right?
Absolutely.
Because we think about some of the same angles on things.
Sure.
Right. And you know, you're always going to kind of have your own ways of looking at something, but sometimes it takes those questions from people who haven't thought about it before. It makes you actually say, oh, yeah. Yeah. Right. That's why you need all these different
perspectives
in the classroom.
Yep. Yeah. The more perspectives you have, the better.
Absolutely. So we got pharmacon, we got goetia, we've got this epaoide complex.
Yeah. Well, let's fast forward to the big one, which is magic itself.
Right. All right. Well, folks, we're going to do another part of this interview over on Luke's channel, Word Safari. I'll put a link in a card at the top right if you're watching this on YouTube, and an in screen. So go and check that out. And then if you're on Patreon, we're also going to do a exclusive postscript with some of our stories from our long acquaintance.
And there are many.
There are many. So for now, from the beautiful Woods Lake here on the just on the cusp of autumn perfection here in beautiful western Colorado, we're wishing you all the best.